it all.
What would you recommend for someone who's looking to get published?
Start at that end, go this way.
I'm not going to take that. I don't really publish anything at the moment. I'm kind of strictly come from a performance background, and I'm starting to move into sort of thinking more about publication in print. But I quite like publication through performance because it allows me to mess around with the work. As you maybe saw earlier, I just sort of break away from the poem and say random things, which sort of gives hopefully a unique experience to each audience I chat to. So for me, that's a certain angle of publication, actually. So.
In terms of individual pieces, if you wanted to get just an individual poem published somewhere, first of all, obviously do your research, have a look, see who's open for submissions. At the end of the day, nothing's going to get published unless you actually send things out there. So it is a risk. There is that emotional aspect of it. It does get easier, I absolutely promise you. A lot of places will charge submission fees, unfortunately, especially if it's for a competition. That can be difficult sometimes. You have to take the good with the bad, unfortunately. There are a lot of online magazines, a lot of websites especially, that do take free submissions. One I'd recommend being Spillwords. They're a very good website in terms of they're very open to the type of material they publish, and they have quite a large social media presence as well. So put it this way, they published my work, or some of my work about a year ago, and they still share it on their Twitter profile recently. So that's one I'd recommend for you. In terms of a full collection, obviously make sure you have a manuscript with you, make sure you've gone over it as many times as possible. And yeah, just do your research, make sure you're approaching the right people. There's no point sending a very left-leaning collection to a very right-leaning publisher or vice versa, so just make sure you're approaching the right people.
Yeah, I would say careful research before you submit things to magazines. I entered quite a few competitions. The way I got published was by reading an open mic session. I was approached by publishers, Dempsey and Windle. I think I really offended them because when Janice came up to me and said, are you published? And we could help you get published. And I said, I don't want to go down the self-publishing route. She goes, no, we're not self-publishing. But no, just keep at it, just keep persevering.
And yeah, and the poetry library is very well worth knowing about it in the Royal Festival Hall. And you can it has an online, it has a website, and it has this huge list of journals and magazines. I would say get hold of that either online or go to the libraries near Waterloo. So.
Follow poets and magazines that you're interested in and that you like on Twitter and on other social media platforms, because they will quite often advertise and publicise submission opportunities on there. If you're starting out and the Writers and Artists Yearbook is like this massive, great big, thing. Mislexia magazine have published a guide to small indie presses. So they've done all the legwork, and they found all the small independent presses in the UK that are open to submissions. So I would invest in a copy of that. It's about £12, and then you can target the publications that are looking for your type of writing and send work to them. And if you're a woman who's writing, subscribe to Mislexia magazine. That's a magazine that exists to publish writing by women, and they have loads of submission opportunities, and some of them you get paid for, which is an added bonus. Yeah, so that would be my advice.
Another thing, I mean, everything everybody said is true. Another thing is start locally. For instance, there is a student magazine, Vortex. That's a place to start. We have magazines in the library, poetry magazines. That's quite good too. Get a sense of what's out there. And as somebody's mentioned, take part in a poetry reading. You never know who's listening. I've got lucky twice that way myself. So that but there are things happening locally. And just read a lot, get a sense of what's out there, work out what you like, what you don't like, because you won't like everything, and you'll get a sense of who's publishing the kind of thing that has an affinity with what you like to do. the things you like to write. But starting locally is often quite good advice too.
Listen, if I can just come back, I mean, you've got to get lots of individual poems published before you start thinking of manuscripts. So if you look at any collection, they'll have an acknowledgements page. You'll see all the journals and magazines that they've been in. And so you've got to, I mean, sometimes people start thinking, oh, well, I'll send my collection here, there, and everywhere. Well, publishers are often going to say, well, where are these poems already been published? They want to know that. So that's the sort of first process to get individual poems published.
And that's why that small presses book that I mentioned is really good, because it lists it's literary magazines as well, so you can target the magazines that are more likely to publish the kind of writing that you're doing. So, build up that portfolio, if you like, of publications. They could be really small magazines, but it's a publication that you can put on your writer's CV. So,
Maybe I'm slightly biased as well, but I would definitely recommend, if you can afford the entry fee, and it does vary from place to place, but again, start entering competitions. Half the time they are blind read, so a lot of the time they don't particularly care what your background is in the competition. I know for a fact the National Poetry Competition is blind read. They've already done that this year, but they'll be opening again probably about September, October-ish. So yeah, keep an eye on that one, keep an eye on any of the major publications. And yeah, just don't be afraid to actually say to yourself, no, this is good enough to compete with other poems, because it is a competition at the end of the day. And having a win, even if it's a shortlisting or whatever, will stand on its own merit. It will make people look at you and say, hold on a second, this was worth reading.
Any questions? Can be, doesn't have to be, we all have to answer every question.
No.
There's quite a few of them this year.
Questions for, I've forgotten the name already, with the
Oh, me.
yeah, sorry. Is it very odd to stand in front of people and say the poems that you do that's so personal?
Yes, it is. There is a
How
point.
do you own
There is a point where the very first poem that I had published was based on a birthday card that my father sent me. It was the very last contact that I ever had with him before he died. And I think there does come a point where once that was published and once it became available to read, that was a point where I had to say to myself, okay, I am okay with people reading this. I am okay with this being acknowledged. There was a really good book that I read by a poet called Warson Shire. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her. And again, it's a very, very personal collection, but you have to take it with a grain of salt, because for all these stories that I've told right now could be entirely fabricated. They could very well be, and there is always that performance element to poetry, as there is with any form of writing. Most of this is honest. If I'm gonna break character for a moment and say most of this is biographical, but parts of it aren't, and I will very much admit that. So there is a point where you have to say to yourself, am I okay with this being known? Am I okay with sharing this aspect of myself? But again, writing is always about having a persona to an extent. No one is entirely the same on stage as they are off stage. And I think I've never gone to a poetry reading or done a poetry reading and had someone come over to me and say, is this true? People make their own assumptions in the audience, and then the barriers get drawn at that stage rather than once you're off the stage, I think.
I think even if your poetry isn't personal, it can still feel quite risky at times standing up in front of people. It's one of those strange things, even if you're avoiding being personal. I remember the first time I did it, I read so fast and mumbled into my poem so much that another poet took the poem off me and reread it. And showed me how to do it.
Oh, that's tragic.
And it wasn't a personal poem.
And I guess sometimes people laugh at moments that you didn't think were very funny, and then they don't laugh at a line you thought was really hilarious, which could be a bit discombobulating, in the moment. But you just, and then you share the same material with a different audience and get a different response. So yeah.
I think going off of that, I was thinking this when I was on my way down. I'm not naturally a funny person, and I will never claim to be a funny person, so I never try and force that aspect when I'm on stage, even though if you're naturally funny, if you are that way inclined, it's very easy to get a good audience and to get an audience on your side. I'm not that way, and it would be disingenuous for me to pretend to be funny, to pretend to be a comedian. This book's all about lying, and it would be hypocritical of me to take part in that. in that act of manipulation, I guess. So no, be very true to yourself when you're reading, I think. And if you are a personal poet, if you are someone who wants to share very heart-wrenching stories, very deep personal stories, then do that. If you are a naturally light, funny person who just wants to entertain for 15 minutes, then do that. But always make sure that you're playing to your strengths rather than trying to be what you think is popular, I think. At the end of the day, that funny people exist and they're fantastic, but I'm quite happy to leave them to be funny, and for me just to do whatever on earth that you call what I do.
And I think in this module we've probably in different ways talked about this. You know, we've used that term that was a journalistic term. You know, Robert Lowell brought out Life Studies. You know, confessional poetry, and you know, the whole question of to what extent. I mean, I think there's a broad assumption, isn't there, that obviously poetry is going to have something to do with yourself. You know, but the question of how revelatory it's going to be, these are your decisions, aren't they? No one has to write about things they don't want to write about. Robert Lowell famously said, "Just say what happened," and actually sometimes that is the best way. Just say what happened. But I mean, of course, you've got to be prepared to do that.
I very much believe something can be honest without necessarily being factual. I think if you're telling the truest version of an experience, we don't need to know what someone had for breakfast that morning unless you think it is relevant somehow. So I think if you're being honest to the core of the experience, then you're probably telling a better story than if you detail every minute step to the toilet and back. So if you want to be that type of honest poet, then yeah, just aim for what the experience means to you, because we can never truly tell how it happened to someone else. So you can only ever tell it from your perspective, and your perspective will, by nature, be biased. So that's part of the process that just needs to be accepted.
You're inadvertently giving everyone ideas for poems. They're going to be inundated with poems about trips to the toilet, breakfast.
Philip Larkin, his trip to the toilet.
Yeah. That's your aim, like, leave today.
Right, next week.
Poem about
Toilet.
toilet, yeah. Before, during, or after.
This is based on sort of the length of time it takes to craft a poem. Have you ever just written a poem just off the cuff, really instinctively, and has that been sort of something you've not bothered worrying after that? You just kind of gone, yeah, that's it, nailed it.
Yeah, the first time it happened to me quite early on, when I first started writing poetry. I didn't expect it would ever happen. You know, I thought I took on board the idea that you wrote on things that seemed to make sense to me. But then one day I woke up and this poem was in my head, and I wrote it down, and I didn't have a title, and I couldn't change the poem. Every time I tried to change it, it made it worse, so I left it alone. But it took about 2 years to get a title, and then it was published. But that was the first time it happened. But speaking personally, those are wonderful moments when they just arrive from nowhere. That's wonderful.
I think. Oh, sorry. After you.
So I had a sort of a one-sentence poem. I'm usually driving home on a Friday. There's something, I always have Radio 4 in the car. There's something come on where people phone in and they describe their week in one sentence. And I'll just read one sentence very quickly. Symmetry. My perfect child of 27 summers, today I collected your ashes in melancholic symmetry. They weigh exactly as you did as a newborn. So I heard it on the radio, but not in that order. But by the time I got home, it was a poem.
Sort of on a similar vein, I'm not going to read it out because it's a bit longer. When I was still living in Winchester, there was a busker shelter built not on the main high street, it was on one of the roads off from the town centre. And there was a notice board held up against the wall where people could pin little messages to each other. It was almost like a physical social media on this little board hanging up against the wall. And some of the messages on there really struck out to me. One of which being, I might have to actually look at the poem now, I'm not going to do that. It was, thank you for the coffee, hope to see you soon, back on duty Wednesday. And there was all these different communications going on in this really slow manner. And then 3 weeks later, council tore it down. And all of that was just gone. And I used to walk past this regularly on my way to the train station, and it really bothered me. And because I could remember some of these notes in my head, I felt the need to put them into the form of a poem, almost as if to preserve them, because this had just been taken away. It was something that was part of a small community, and then it was just gone. So that poem was very, very much based on these little messages. Most of it was recordings rather than me embellishing anything that was there. So that one happened very quickly in that sense.
There's a sense that when you're trying to make, well, I find when I sit down, I'm like, I'm going to make the poem, right? I'm like, yes, that it has that energy of like something that just came out, like pure instinct. And it's almost that I feel like the practice of the poet, you are training yourself to be able to make every poem feel like it happened like that, even though it has aeons of craft beneath it, right? Like, and it is amazing how sometimes it does happen like that, and you're sort of like, well, you know, Julian told me to break every single experience into these, like this tiny snapshot or something like that, right? And it kind of goes against like the craft message. So it's, I do think it's interesting how you also have to learn to know when to step into craft something, and also know when that you just sort of leave. Also, like you leave the instinct as it occurs. But yeah, it's how do you do that? Because it's different for every poem as well, right? So I do find a lot of, especially as you write more and more, now I'm kind of just endlessly faced with the problem of like, how do I sound different in this next poem, but still be me as well.
And you can also occupy other people's experiences. So in other words, you hear a close friend or somebody who tells you a story about themselves, and they're not poets, and so they're not going to write about it.
So you can steal it.
Yeah. So in this case, the first person, it feels that it's you because you're saying hi, aren't you? But you're actually, and actually, sometimes when you do that, you can write. It's really personal, and yeah, I mean, there are all these little sort of. I think the question of what you do with the eye is always fascinating in poetry.
How do you make yourself be creative? I find that when I'm creative at random points, that say I've got like an assignment due and I go and sit in the library to do that creative project, I have the creativity of a like preschool artwork, and it's just not talented at all. So how do you? But then when like I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'll write something and I'll be really proud of it, and it'll be like I don't have anything to do. This is not for anything. So when you have like something you need to do, how do you make yourself be creative and talented and not just produce crap?
I must admit, I find, I actually have the opposite problem, which I think is important sometimes not to write anything. And so I actually try to take time off. And it's actually really hard to do because you sort of feel, okay, what is my life then? But sometimes that's just personal. I think I have writer's blocks and I try to ignore them, but I should just go with them, is my feeling about it. And then when I'm inspired, I write a lot. But obviously, you're in a different situation. We're trying to get you, I suppose we're trying to get you to develop habits by which you can tap into your imagination. We know it's an artificial situation, but you will leave here you'll be much more creative and you'll have all kinds of skills when it comes to tapping into your own creativity. Sometimes it's even just recognizing when you've thought something poetic. Like I often find that I'm walking around thinking something, and it takes me a while to realize that's a poem. You know, you don't even know you're doing it sometimes. So sometimes it's just a case of learning to listen to your own voice and recognizing when it's actually something worth working on.
Do you take notes on your phone?
Yeah, I write in a notebook.
Yeah. Just almost make yourself a stranger to those notes, like that it doesn't feel like you even, and then almost set yourself, this is when working within deadlines, so you're almost like, you're not sitting down trying to be like, cool, I've got to crank out a poem, I'm just going to respond to these 3 prompts or something. So you kind of put yourself in a problem solving mode, and that's when actually creativity slightly accelerates. I'm not saying it's not then perfect, because again, like this whole idea of habits, it's really key. Like if you show up every morning and you wake up at 5 and you like make yourself write for like 3 hours, that will eventually become the process kind of thing. So I do recommend like almost giving yourself problems to solve actually, I think, really helps. And also, don't discourage the 3-year-old the preschooler. There's some dynamite ideas in preschool art. I think sometimes we focus too much on making something meaningful straight away, or something that's like, look at how well I crafted this metaphor or something. Sometimes just play with nonsense, right? Cut up a bunch of articles and piss about, play, yeah. And I think that way you start to actually give less of a shit about trying to make an idea, and then you actually then make thousands of ideas far quicker that have actual potential.
I find keeping a journal is good.
Yeah.
That's been a good thing for me, because I find I'm still going back to journals I kept years ago, and I wasn't even writing things I thought were poetry. I didn't even know why I was bothering to keep the journal, but over time, that's how I write.
And remember as well that just because you've written something, just because you have a completed poem that you've got from A to B with, don't feel like it necessarily needs to be published. Again, as you were saying before, mess around, play with language. Not everything you write needs to be shown to the world. So if you write something and you look at it and say, okay, this is a load of bollocks, then you don't need to feel compelled to do anything with it. There were a lot of poems that I cut from this because I either didn't think they were appropriate for it, or because I just thought they were awful. I just thought they're not good enough for it. So some of those might be put to use in the future. A lot of them probably won't. A lot of them will just languish in the drafts folder on the computer. But that's okay. That's absolutely fine. Probably, I think, if you are very serious about the quality of your work, if you take yourself, not necessarily take yourself quite seriously, but if you're quite dedicated to your project, most of what you write will be a load of rubbish. But that's fine, because what you have left will be good. So I'd rather read a collection of 20 really good poems than 60 awful ones. So yeah, don't feel compelled to have everything be brilliant.
Was it Zadie Smith who wrote about the shitty first draft?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think as well, if you allow yourself the freedom to if you're always thinking this has got to be the most creative, imaginative, brilliant, soul-searching, thought-provoking thing I've ever written, that can become a barrier, to writing anything. So, you just, read Zadie Smith's essay on the shitty first draft and free yourself, from the need for everything to be, because that shitty, you uncover under the shit, but a gradual process. You revisit it and it's less shitty, or the fact that it's shitty becomes a virtue, and you can do something, with,
Smell.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, you have to write quite a lot of not very good stuff before you can write good. So, in a sense, lots of writing exercises, you might think, you're just getting a little bit nearer to something that's going to be really good.
I found when I was rummaging through my cupboards a little while ago, I found a folder full of my old university work, and in that folder was the very first selection of poetry that I wrote for the Year 1 poetry module, and let's just say it will never be shown to anyone ever. I will die before people read those poems, but that's okay, because that was the module where I realised that I wasn't doing very well, but I enjoyed it. So I took it in second year, and I took it in third year, and I did it for my master's, and it went from there. Those first poems were terrible, but I'm glad they were in a sense, because it made me realise, hold on, this is something I need to get better at.
A last question, anybody?
I don't have a question, but I'm really pleased to go.
Fine.
Farewell.
We'll take that as a hint. Well, thank you very much for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it.